Well, we have been here before, and it did not end well for the madman at the center of the plot, the president with an enemies list. The big difference between disgraced Republican President Richard Nixon and disgraced Republican President Donald Trump is that Richard Nixon did not spend his life locked in a Trumpian prison of stupidity, a prison from which Donald Trump has never even tried to escape. Donald Trump could have had a moment in high school when he decided, you know what? I should really learn something here. He could have had a moment like that in college. He could have decided to stay home one night and read a book instead of partying with Jeffrey Epstein, but he didn't. He never did. Richard Nixon grew up poor. He inherited nothing. He worked hard in high school. He worked hard all the way through Whittier College and Duke Law School, worked his way through. Richard Nixon was constantly trying to learn, but he never learned enough to contain his darkest criminal impulses that destroyed him in the end, forcing him to resign the presidency in scandal. One big difference between Republican Donald Trump and Republican Richard Nixon is that Richard Nixon did not make his enemies list public. We are learning in new reporting from the Wall Street Journal that Donald Trump intended to send a personal private text to his Attorney General, Pam Bondi, demanding the criminal prosecution of former FBI Director James Comey, New York State Attorney General Letitia James, and California Senator Adam Schiff. But what he actually composed instead of a text and what he actually sent was a social media post that became available to the entire world. The Wall Street Journal reports Trump believed he had sent Bondi the message directly, addressing it to Pam, and was surprised to learn it was public, according to U.S. officials familiar with the matter. The misfire provided a window into how, through command and chaos, Trump has executed a wholesale transformation of the Justice Department. Donald Trump is going to Walter Reed National Military Medical Center tomorrow for another physical, only 6 months after his last physical, and he very proudly told reporters today that he expects to do very well on another cognitive exam to detect evidence of dementia. Luckily for Donald Trump, texting is not on the cognitive function exam. Most important thing to know about the enemies list is that it was a badge of honor. When the full version of the Nixon enemies list was unveiled by the Nixon White House counsel, John Dean, at the Watergate hearings, by that time, everyone was hoping they were on it.
The next is a document dated September 9th, 1971. It's from Charles Colson to John Dean, in which Mr. Colson has checked in blue those that he would give top priority on the enemies list, and an attached series of lists that were prepared by Mr. Colson's office of what were deemed opponents or political enemies.
In a secret memo written by John Dean in the Nixon White House 2 years before the Watergate investigation, John Dean outlined, quote, how we can use the available federal machinery to screw our political enemies. And it didn't work. Some people had their telephones tapped, they had their taxes audited, but for just about all of the 200 or so people in the full version of the Nixon enemies list, nothing happened. In fact, they didn't get screwed, they thrived. Gene Hackman won his first Oscar while he was secretly on the Nixon enemies lists. Gregory Peck didn't have to give back his Oscar because he was on Nixon's enemies list, along with Paul Newman and Steve McQueen and New York Jets quarterback Joe Namath, who was erroneously listed as the New York Giants quarterback. That's how crazy the Nixon enemies list was. Dozens of members of the news media were on the list when it came out, including 3 from the Boston Globe, which the Globe then lorded over other newspapers with fewer entries on the enemies list. Sander Van Oker made the list to make NBC News proud. 12 senators were on the list, including 1 Republican. None of them got screwed by Richard Nixon and his White House thugs in any way. Every black member of Congress was on the Nixon enemies list because, of course, the list was also racist, in addition to being crazy. Harvard could not have been prouder of its most famous professor at the time, economist John Kenneth Galbraith, for making the Nixon enemies list. Yale's president was on the Nixon enemies list. Harvard Law School's dean was on the Nixon enemies list. And the most famous surgeon in America at the time, Texas heart surgeon Michael DeBakey, for some Nixonian reason, was on Nixon's enemies list. The most famous conductor and composer in America at the time, Leonard Bernstein, was no one's enemy except Richard Nixon's. And he could not have been prouder. And so the badges of honor are being awarded once again, and it will end the same way. Donald Trump's enemies list is the badge of honor of our era. And today, New York State Attorney General Letitia James got one of those badges when the same possibly illegally appointed acting U.S. attorney who indicted James Comey indicted Attorney General James. Attorney General James is being indicted in a 3.5-page, 2-count indictment for 1 count of bank fraud and 1 count of false statement to a financial institution, because on a mortgage application, Attorney General James indicated that she would use a second home she was buying as a second home. And then at some time after that, after she bought the home, she apparently, according to the indictment, that home, quote, was not occupied or used by James as a secondary residence and was instead used as a rental investment property, renting the property to a family of 3. Now, millions of people in America have done exactly that. Millions of people in America have obtained mortgages for their primary home or their secondary home, and then decided at some point to rent out that house. And none of them thought they had to then immediately refinance their homes, because they didn't. They were just renting out their property. The key words in this indictment that the most incompetent acting U.S. attorney in history offered absolutely no proof of, the key words are, as James then knew. This indictment presents as a fact that Attorney General James knew when she was filling out the application form that she would later rent out the house. And if she didn't know that at the time that she was filling out the form, or if she just hadn't decided at the time if she was going to rent out the house, there is no possible crime in this case. This is a state of mind crime. And the prosecution doesn't know her state of mind. The prosecution will never be able to prove what they claim is a fact. The indictment says James represented and affirmed in uniform residential loan applications and related documents that the property would be used as a secondary residence. This is the key part. When in truth and fact, as James then knew, those are the most important words here. As James then knew, the property was intended and used as an investment property. So this entire case comes down to the prosecution having to prove what it claims is a fact, that Attorney General James then knew and that she intended to rent out the property. This is state of mind. You have to be able to read her state of mind to do this prosecution. If you fill out your application for your home mortgage and you say the property is for your own use, and then after you own the property, if you decide to rent out that property, you have every legal right in the world to rent out that property. And no one can come along and prosecute you because your mortgage application didn't say you were going to at some point rent out your property. We live in a place that we like to call a free country. And one of your freedoms is renting out your property. And you can decide to do that at any time after you buy that property. And so, imagine this prosecutor has never prosecuted a case in her life, trying to convince a trial jury that Attorney General James willfully lied on the application and always knew that she was going to rent out the property. That is simply not a provable state of mind, and the prosecutor cannot call Attorney General James as a witness to ask her what her state of mind was. And so there's a very strong chance that this case, if it makes it to trial, will get a directed verdict from the judge finding that the prosecution was incapable of proving what it claims in writing in the indictment is a fact. Attorney General James' state of mind. So Attorney General James is probably on her way to take her place in history with former FBI Director James Comey at the top of the Trump enemies list and as the people who beat the madman in the White House in court, because that is what is likely to happen here. You can listen to all sorts of lawyers talk about this case, but it comes down to the same elements as the James Comey case. The first motions are going to be to disqualify this new acting U.S. attorney. Those motions will very probably succeed. The other motions will be to identify this as a selective and prejudicial prosecution. Those motions will likely succeed, and that'll be the end of the case. Attorney General James has already beaten Donald Trump in court for business fraud practices in the state of New York. Donald Trump's appealing that case in the state of New York. James Comey and Letitia James have the best defense lawyers you can possibly have in these cases. They're going to win. Donald Trump is going to lose. Don't worry about them. You don't have to worry about them. There is much to summon our outrage about in the madness of the Trump presidency. But the people who Donald Trump has so far dragged into court could not possibly be better equipped or better financed to fight Donald Trump in court and crush him. What Donald Trump is doing to other people in court, what he's doing to immigrants in this country who show up at federal courts for their appointments and then get thrown to the floor by masked men and beaten and dragged away from their families and shipped off to countries that they've never been to, they deserve the full force of your outrage. Those people have no resources. They have no voice. They've done nothing wrong. They've tried to do everything right. They went to that federal court to do everything right, and their lives are already ruined. They cannot wear their deportation as a badge of honor. But the Attorney General of the state of New York can.
This is nothing more than a continuation of the president's desperate weaponization of our justice system. He is forcing federal law enforcement agencies to do his bidding, all because I did my job as the New York State Attorney General. These charges are baseless, and the president's own public statements make clear that his only goal is political retribution at any cost. The president's actions are a grave violation of our constitutional order and have drawn sharp criticism from members of both parties. His decision to fire a United States attorney who refused to bring charges against me and replace them with someone who is blindly loyal not to the law, but to the president is antithetical to the bedrock principles of our country. This is the time for leaders on both sides of the aisle to speak out against this blatant perversion of our system of justice. I stand strongly behind my office's litigation against the Trump Organization. We conducted a 2-year investigation based on the facts and evidence, not politics. Judges have upheld the trial court's finding that Donald Trump, his company, and his 2 sons are liable for fraud. I'm a proud woman of faith, and I know that faith and fear cannot share the same space. And so today, I'm not fearful. I'm fearless. And as my faith teaches me, no weapon formed against me shall prosper. We will fight these baseless charges aggressively and my office will continue to fiercely protect New Yorkers and their rights. And I will continue to do my job.
This blatant perversion of our justice system, that is Donald Trump's perversion. She's right. She has nothing to fear. That smile is real. She knows she's going to win. She knows Donald Trump's going to lose. And she knows she can wear her place on the Trump enemies list as a badge of honor for the rest of her life.